We've had about, over 7,000 people registered for this series. That includes those who want to come back and view the recordings. We've had gardeners and naturalists, professionals in the horticulture industry, lots of folks here to learn about native plants to enhance both what we know about native plants, what we can do in the garden, and the links those native plants have to biodiversity. So our first presenter on this series is Dr. Mary Gardiner. She's a professor here at OSU in the Department of Entomology, where she teaches extension, grant writing, lots of ecology topics. So a large class load, but also as a researcher out in the field. You may have heard past webinars when she's talked about her work in vacant lands in vacant properties in Cleveland, looking at weeds and what enhancements they add to the ecosystem, and also how adding native plants can enhance that habitat. She's also an author. She's written this book, Good Garden Bugs, which lots of you have on your bookshelves, learning about those natural enemies, those predators that are out there helping to balance our pest problems. So Mary, thanks so much for coming in this morning, getting us started, talking about beneficial insect biodiversity, what it is and why it matters. We're so happy to be starting off with you.
Thanks, Denise. Hi, everyone. This is by far the largest group I've ever had an opportunity to speak to. So I'm really excited that this many people care about insect biodiversity and registered for this amazing series that Denise has put together. Her series have been extremely popular throughout the pandemic, and she and her group do an excellent job. So I'm sure you're all going to enjoy this full list of speakers that are going to be following me. So I get to kick off the series, and what I'm going to do today is talk to you about sort of generally what is beneficial insect biodiversity, what are some of the insects that we might want around our landscape, and then I'm going to hit on just some broad strategies that you can use to support those insects in your home environment. And then subsequent speakers will go into more detail about how to design and implement these strategies to support biodiversity at home. So I'm really excited to be able to kick things off today. I did notice a few of you raised your hands as Denise was doing her introduction. If you do have questions, use the Q&A box because there's so many of you. I can't see who's raising their hand and things. So if questions come up during my presentation, just go ahead and use that Q&A box. And then as Denise mentioned, we'll go through some of those questions at the end. So thank you very much. I'll also give out my email if you want to connect with me that way at the end of the presentation. Okay, so now I'm going to do the fun Zoom thing of trying to share my PowerPoint and hope that that works correctly. Great. So first, I want to tell you a tiny bit about myself. For those that don't know me, I am a professor in the entomology department, as Denise mentioned, and the majority of my appointment is doing research. So I get to work with a great group of graduate students, and we study beneficial insects in residential landscapes and vacant lots, so urban environments. We're very interested in the opportunities that these landscapes can provide for conserving insect faunas. And so we think about ways to design and manage them to support those goals. We also think about more broad residential and urban landscapes. You know, how should habitats be connected and preserved together to maintain the types of habitat insects need? And we think about some of the struggles insects might face in cities, like encountering pollution and things like this that might harm them, and how we can try to mitigate those impacts. I also do a lot of extension work. So I provide programs like this. I also, when we are able to, I visit groups and give live presentations. I work with master gardeners, home gardeners, 4-H groups, things like that. I've done a lot of publications and things along those lines. And I'm also very interested in community science and have run several programs tracking native insects over the years. And I do get to teach our grad students here at Ohio State. I teach classes in ecology, in grant writing, and presentation skills. And I really thought about maybe putting together a webinar about presentation skills for the general public as well. So people that might want to take some of my beneficial insect content, for instance, and provide that to their garden groups. So Let me know if you would be interested in something like that, because it's something I've been thinking about doing in the future. So I get to do all of that as well. But today we're here to learn about beneficial insects. And so that's going to be the focus of my presentation, just the broad diversity of species that we find in a residential landscape that are considered beneficial. So just to start at the beginning, what is biodiversity? So biodiversity is the biological variety of life on Earth. And it can be measured in several ways. And those include genetic diversity, species diversity, or even the diversity of ecosystems that might occur across a landscape. So there's a lot of ways that you can define the richness of fauna that you might find, or the richness of habitats that you might find. And all of those contribute to our global diversity. And insects are a huge component of this biodiversity. Over half of described species are insects. And so these things are everywhere, and they're very, very critical to life on Earth. So why are insects important? Well, many reasons. These insects provide many important ecological functions that we need for a healthy environment. They cycle nutrients as decomposers, and they also are integral roles of food webs. They are prey for many animals, so they provide food for wildlife. And they also prey on many types of other animals, mostly insects and other invertebrates. And in this way, they act as a top-down regulator of those herbivorous and other insects in the environment. They're also pollinators, and so they pollinate our plants, and those plant-pollinator interactions are obviously critical for the success of many of our plant life on Earth. And in many cases, in doing their jobs within ecosystems, these insects benefit humans. And when those roles that insects play in an environment benefit us, either economically or culturally or in other ways, these are considered ecosystem services. And examples of ecosystem services include when a predator insect happens to feed on a pest that we do not desire in our landscape. For instance, this flower wasp here is seeking out grubs in the soil, and she will lay her egg on those grubs, which will then eat the grubs, killing them. So when insects hunt for pests that we do not desire in a landscape, this is called biological control, and it reduces the need for other chemical inputs that someone might use to control pests like a grub. When insects happen to pollinate plants that are our crops, that benefits us immensely. In fact, insects pollinate 75% of crop plants, and this is a bee pollinating a pumpkin flower here. Insects also build healthy soils, and one of the most adorable ways they do that are these dung beetles that break down manure piles and incorporate manure back into the soil. And I'm going to talk about each of these scenarios throughout the presentation. So in today's talk, what are we going to talk about? Well, we're going to talk about these three main groups of insects that provide beneficial ecosystem services in our residential landscapes. These are predators, pollinators, and decomposers, and they all are important components of that insect biodiversity. And then at the end of the presentation, I'm going to talk about how to conserve these insects at home. What are some strategies that you can use? So first off, I want to talk about decomposers. So what are decomposers? These are insects that feed on dead or dying plant tissues. So this could be leaves, garden waste, tree limbs, or woody debris. They're also insects that feed on other dead animals or carrion, and insects that feed on excrement or manure of other animals. So you can see why I chose the leaf picture for this slide. But we're going to talk about each of these groups. So first, insects that feed on many soil and woody dwelling insects feed on leaves and downed woody debris like branches or dead standing or fallen trees. And these insects and other invertebrates break down this leaf material and woody material, and they incorporate that material into the soil. And that creates the humus layer of nutrients in the top of the soil, which is then further broken down by microorganisms, and that releases nutrients and minerals, carbon, nitrogen into the soil that is able to be taken up by plant life. And so this nutrient cycling is absolutely critical for a healthy soil environment and healthy plant community. And there are many invertebrates that perform this critical function. And these include things like ants, fly larvae. This is a crane fly larva in the soil. Mites. The soil has so many mites. If you ever are able to look at a sample of soil under a microscope, it's amazing. And also springtails, which are absolutely adorable soil insects that break down leaves and other decaying plant material. Some of them look like little cows, and they're called springtails because they have this organ called a furcula on their back that allows them to jump around in the soil. There are also many insect decomposers that feed on carrion. So when a dead body occurs, an animal dies in a forest, carrion insects respond. And they respond in a particular order, with blowflies arriving first, and then several rove beetles like this guy, and then carrion beetles like this one. And they break down the carcass rapidly. And again, all of that nutrients then from that animal is being broken down, added back, incorporated into the soil instead of dead animal, just sitting there slowly rotting away by microbes alone. This happens really rapidly. And some insects will also bury the carcass itself. Burying beetles, males and females, will find a small carcass, say a dead field mouse, for instance. They will bury that carcass, and they will then make a small burrow nearby where they will lay their eggs. And then both the male and female will consume the carcass and feed it to their offspring, which incorporates the carcass into the soil and also produces the next generation of burying beetles. And this is a burying beetle feeding its larva here. There are some very rare species of these burying beetles, and several active programs underway to try to save them and increase their abundance across the US. Many decomposers also attack manure piles and break them down. So this includes things like manure flies and dung beetles. Adults are attracted to the manure pile. They lay their eggs on the manure pile. Or in the case of dung beetles, they will break the manure pile apart, go and make a small hole, and then bury the manure ball within that hole and lay their eggs on it. So again, breaking up and distributing the manure, putting the nutrients in the manure back into the soil and incorporating it. This is a really critical function that these insects provide. They also have preferences. So certain insects will only attack cow manure pile for their eggs, and other ones might attack horse manure or so on. So there's a lot of diversity in the types of manure that attracts different species of these decomposers. There are also many insects that act as predators within a environment. Predators are insects that actively hunt for their own prey. Many insect predators are generalists. That means they'll attack many different types of other insects or other prey that they might find. And insects also have a lot of different hunting strategies. For instance, a praying mantis uses visual cues quite a bit in its hunting, whereas this little larva here is a fly maggot that's completely eyeless, and it relies on vibrational stimuli to find its prey. Here is a jumping spider, and again, you can see that it has very large eyes, and it does rely on visual cues and also vibrational cues. And a daddy longlegs here that is an active hunter. It hunts at night, so it's a nocturnal predator and will forage for prey at night, so not using visual cues in this case. So they really vary in the timing of when they're looking for prey. If they're a sit and wait predator like a praying mantis or active hunting species, there's many different strategies. And by cultivating a high biodiversity of these predators, you're able to control a large number of different types of pests you might have in a landscape, because these insects are going and other invertebrates are going to look for different types of prey. They're going to find different types of prey based on their hunting strategy. So I just wanted to talk about a few of the very cool groups that are very common in backyard gardens that you guys might encounter. And one group are the true bugs. The true bugs are predators that use a piercing, sucking beak to attack their prey. So these insects will pierce their prey and then ingest the contents, the liquid contents, and what will be left is sort of a shriveled carcass. And one of the most prolific true bugs that attacks garden pests is the minute pirate bug. It's a very small, about 1/16 of an inch, black and white insect. This is its immature stage. Both of these are predatory. Another common one is the damsel bug. It's about 1/4 inch long. It has these raptorial front legs and piercing beak to grab its prey. And this is the two-spotted stink bug. The two-spotted stink bug, we all know the brown marmorated stink bug is a pest in the US, many parts of the world, but there are some predatory stink bugs. This particular one eats Colorado potato beetles, the larvae and eggs, and it has these brightly colored outlines. So if you find this, if you grow potatoes in your garden and you find these, they're doing good, and they're not something to remove. Another important group of predators are the lacewings. These are really beautiful net-veined insects. They have the green lacewing has a long green body. They're about 1 inch long. This is their life cycle. They have eggs that appear on little stalks. Those eggs hatch into these alligator-like larvae, and these larvae attack aphids. And you can see this one here in this patch of aphids. They use their piercing jaws to pierce the aphid and ingest the contents. Lacewings are also cool because some species of lacewing are naked, like this guy, and some are called debris carrying. And these debris carrying lacewing larvae look exactly like the naked one, except for they also have this ball of fluff and dead bodies of their prey and plant material that they pile on top of themselves so that they can conceal themselves from would-be predators like a bird or larger insect. Our next group are ground beetles. If you have a garden that has tilled soil that's open, you have a very good chance of seeing one of these when the sun hits your soil. If you see this shiny beetle running fast across your soil, you're very likely to have seen a ground beetle. These are usually either shiny black or metallic. They're called ground beetles because they're most often found in mulch or on the soil surface, but some species will climb plant material too. You can see this hunting species on tree bark. These eat a variety of different caterpillars, many of which are pests. They also feed on snails and slugs, certain species. So a number of different prey. Another common group of insect predators are the lady beetles. There's a number of different species of lady beetles that you can find in a backyard garden. They're not all red and black. Some are different colors, as you can see here. The adults are predators of aphids, scales, or whiteflies, depending on the species. And the larvae will feed on the same prey as the adults of their species. The larvae, similar to the lacewing larvae, look kind of like a little alligator. And so sometimes it's hard to identify the immature stages of these different insects. So I like to try to include pictures of both. Another important group of predators are flies. So oftentimes people don't think of flies as being part of beneficial biodiversity. You know, everyone gets annoyed with fruit flies or house flies, but there are many flies that provide important functions in the environment. And one of those are the hover or syrphid flies. This is a group of flies that are predatory as larvae and they're pollinators as adults. So they check multiple boxes. They often mimic bees and wasps. So you can see this guy kind of looks like a honeybee. And this one looks a bit like a shiny wasp, but these are both flies. You can tell they're flies because they only have 2 wings instead of 4, and they have very large eyes. So you can see here these big eyes connecting across the head. So sometimes you have to do a double take when you're in the garden and see if what you're looking at is really what you think you're looking at. These are the larvae of these species. The larvae look like little slugs. If you see these little slugs within patches of aphids, they're doing you good. They're going to be consuming the aphids. You can see these little shriveled things on the side of this one. Those are dead aphids, and same here. So you'll notice sometimes some browning or like kind of material around them. That's ones that it's already eaten. So if you leave these alone in the patch, they will continue to consume the aphids. In some cases, when people see these, they think they might have 2 pests on a plant, an aphid and another pest. Wasps. People don't often think of wasps as beneficial, but they're incredibly important predators of many different kinds of insects. important roles in food webs. They don't always eat insects we think of as pests, but they are doing some really cool things that we might not notice at first. So it's important to know what they're doing out there. So there are many types of wasps that are solitary, that each female makes her own nest and provisions it with prey of some kind. And usually they pick a particular type of prey. So for instance, this is a mud dauber. It's making this mud nest. The mud dauber will provision this nest with spiders. The spider wasp also attacks spiders. It paralyzes the spider and then drags the paralyzed spider to its burrow, takes the spider down in the burrow, and then lays eggs on it, and its larvae eat the paralyzed spider. So if you don't like spiders, you might like these wasps, even though spiders are beneficial. So some people have seen, if you've ever seen a wasp dragging a spider across a sidewalk or something, that's what's going on. This is a cutworm wasp. Cutworms are a really significant pest insect, and this does the same thing as a spider wasp, but with cutworms. This is the flower wasp I mentioned earlier. This guy will find, or a girl will find grubs, white grubs, like Japanese beetle larvae in the soil of turf, and its larvae consume those. And this is the potter wasp. It makes these super cute pots out of mud on plant material. There's a hole just big enough for it to stuff in inchworm larvae into that pot. And then she will turn around and lay an egg in the pot before sealing it off. So I found a few of these over the years. They're hard to find sometimes, but they're very cool. So be on the lookout for those. Spiders. Spiders are something that a lot of people are afraid of, but really there's no reason to be afraid. Spiders are really not out to get you. They're trying to find prey, to reproduce and to survive this season. So spiders provide a huge amount of pest control in natural environments as well as residential landscapes. There's a huge diversity of spiders, and when you see them up close, they're actually can be very pretty. This is an example of an orb weaving spider. So many spiders will build a web. That web will catch all kinds of prey that the spider eats, and other prey that it kind of doesn't care about, like tiny little midges and things like that. But it's still taking those insects, if they're pests, out of the environment, like something like mosquitoes, for instance. Not all spiders build webs. Some of them are active hunters. An example is a wolf spider. Wolf spiders are incredibly important predators in agricultural environments, including home gardens. They're also very common in those environments. Wolf spiders can be identified by being large, typically gray and black, occurring on the soil. But if you find a female and she has her egg sac, they're really easy to identify because the females carry that egg sac on their abdomen. It's a type of parental care. And then that goes even further because when the spiders hatch, they ride on the mother spider until they get to a certain life stage and size, and then they disperse. And this reduces other spiders and insects preying on these very small spiderlings. Usually if people can't stand spiders, I can maybe convert them with the jumping spider. It's probably considered the cutest spider. You might have seen the peacock spider on Facebook before. These are called the jumping spider because they pounce on their prey. So they use their very large eyes to detect an insect prey, and then they will jump and they attach a silk thread to the plant material they jump from so that if they miss or something, they can climb back up. And this particular one, Phidippus, has these amazing jaws that have this metallic. Crab spiders are also very interesting predators. You can tell where they get the name, right? They look like a little crab. They are a sit and wait spider predator. So they will sit on a plant with their big legs on the front held out. And when something comes close, they will grab it with the legs. So some of these hunt in soil, some of them hunt on flowers. Some of the ones that hunt on flowers can change color to match the flower. So these spiders are doing a lot of cool things out in our backyard. In addition to predators, there are also parasitoid insects. Parasitoid insects differ from predators in that they don't actively hunt down their prey themselves. So in the case of parasitoids, the adult female will find the prey for her offspring. And instead of being a generalist, like where most predator species will eat maybe a few to like many different types of prey. Most parasitoids are highly specialized. So that female will look for one type or a small number of types of prey, and that is where she will lay her eggs of her offspring. And a parasitoid lifestyle is most common within the wasp and fly groups of insects. And so I wanted to give some examples of some that you might look for. So within the flies, the tachinid fly family is huge. There are thousands of species of these. And each species, as I said, will find a particular type of prey. They all look sort of different, but in general, tachinids tend to be kind of bristly flies. So you can see here, they have these really significant bristles. I wanted to focus on this particular one. It's really kind of a cool one and attacks a major pest. This is called the feather-legged fly. It has an orange abdomen and it has a significant set of bristles on its back leg. This insect eats the squash bug. The squash bug is a major pest of cucurbits. So if you grow things like cucumbers or squash in your garden, you really want to find this parasitoid fly. And this drawing is an illustration of its life cycle. So what happens is the adult female will look for the squash bugs. She will get on top of the squash bug and lay her eggs on it. Her larvae will burrow inside the squash bug. They will kill the squash bug and eat it. And then when they are ready to pupate, they come out through the back end of the squash bug and make a cocoon in the soil. So within a cucurbit patch, all of this activity is happening. And these are actively reducing squash bug. Another important tachinid is this species here that is coming out of a cucumber beetle. So another big pest of squash and pumpkins and things. This one, just like the squash bug fly, will eat the inside of the cucumber beetle. And then when it goes to make its cocoon, it pops the head off of the cucumber beetle and emerges and makes its cocoon. So this is actually a cocoon. We took this picture in a petri dish. We had this one in a dish, and that the head has been decapitated off the cucumber beetle. In addition to fly parasitoids, there are many wasp parasitoids. Flies do not have an ovipositor where they're able to lay an egg inside of a prey, so they lay it on the prey. But wasp parasitoids are able to actually sting a pest or other insect and lay their egg inside of it. If you've ever been in a garden and seen a wasp where you can visually see what you think is its stinger, that wasp cannot sting you. Wasps that can sting you have a tiny stinger that you would not see the actual stinger on the end of their abdomen. They would have a pointy abdomen that you would see, but you would not see a long, skinny thing coming out of that. If you can see that, it's a type of parasitoid. And that stinger that you see really isn't a stinger, it's their ovipositor. And the point of that organ is to allow the wasp to sting its host and put its eggs inside of its host. And they cannot sting us with that ovipositor, which is a good thing when you see ones like this one, which is a large ichneummonid wasp. And this entire structure is its giant ovipositor. And this wasp itself with the ovipositor is more than 3 inches long. And you may have seen these. They do occur in cities and in residential landscapes. This is a picture you can see. This is my dad's old Suburban several years ago. I took this picture in his driveway. My parents lived in a small town. This is one of their trees. The tree had a bunch of sawfly larvae inside of it. And what's happening here is this female has stung the tree. She's able to actually use that ovipositor to go inside the tree and lay her eggs inside those sawfly larvae. And just like I showed in the drawing of the squash bug, this offspring of this wasp will kill those pests and then eventually emerge from that tree. Now, not all wasp parasitoids are huge like this. In fact, the majority of the fauna is tiny, like the size of a flake of pepper. And this is an example of one of the tiny species. This wasp is attacking an aphid, and there is a lot of different species of parasitoid wasps that do attack aphid pests. This is a drawing of the life cycle here. So here's the female. She's able to turn her abdomen like a sword underneath her and then sting the aphid. She lays an egg in it. The egg develops, kills the aphid. and then the wasp actually pupates in the aphid. When they construct this pupal cocoon inside the dead aphid, the aphids will turn either brown or black, and these are called aphid mummies. So this aphid is dead and stuck to the plant, and the wasp is inside of it in this picture. And sometimes when you look at a patch of aphids on your plant, you'll see that some of them are brown and black and some of them are green and look healthy. And what's happened there is that a wasp has come through and stung some of those, and some of them probably also have been attacked, but they just haven't turned into mummies yet. So it's a good idea to leave that patch alone, because wasps will be emerging from that patch and then attacking other aphids in the area. Wasps don't only attack aphids, they attack all kinds of different insects, some that are pests, some that aren't pests. Here's an example of a caterpillar that has cocoons on it. So in some cases, because this is a big caterpillar, the wasp was able to lay several eggs within the caterpillar, and then those eggs emerged as cocoons and made their cocoons, the larvae emerged and made their cocoons on the caterpillar. And in tomatoes, tomato hornworm caterpillars are attacked by a braconid wasp parasitoid. And sometimes you can find one like this that has cocoons all over it. And if you find that, just leave it in the garden. That's not going to be doing any more damage to your plants, and those wasps will emerge. And if you have other caterpillars, they will find them and attack. So in addition to all of these creepy predators and parasitoids that are doing all kinds of stuff in our landscape, we also benefit from the work of bees and other pollinators. But I'm going to focus briefly on some social and solitary bees today, just to show some diversity. So what are bees doing in our environment? Well, both males and female bees feed on nectar, plant nectar, but female bees also collect pollen as food from their offspring. So bees are not out there trying to help us out by pollinating plants. They're not trying to benefit humans. They're trying to collect food for their own survival of their offspring. And in the process of this, they accidentally transfer large quantities of pollen between flowers. And so what you're seeing here are bees absolutely covered with pollen working to collect resources. So there are many, many species of bees in the US. In fact, just in Ohio, we have 500 species of bees. Most of those are solitary bees. A few of those are social bees, but people tend to know the social bees more. So for example, a honeybee is a social bee. Bumblebees are also social bees. Social bees live in colonies and they work together to make one nest and provision it. And there's usually one queen and then many female workers that construct, provision, and defend that nest. And this is an example of a social bee nest. This is a bumblebee nest. And you can see that there are many, many workers tending the nest. You can see this great big one in the middle, that's the queen. And she is laying eggs and the workers are caring for those offspring. These closed cells are cocoons where bees are developing into adults from pupae. And some of these open cells on the edges are called honey pots. And that's where the workers that are going out into the environment and bringing back pollen and nectar are storing it. And then they use that to feed the larvae. So in Ohio, we have a few species of bumblebees. And of course, people cultivate honeybees. But we have hundreds of species as well of solitary bees, which I feel like are a little bit less known. So in solitary bees, instead of a bunch of individuals working together, here, females construct and provision their own nest without the help of other members of the species. And this represents 90% of North America's bee species. So here, one female will make a nest, for example, in the soil, and she will dig a tunnel and make a nest area, put pollen and nectar ball in that nest area and lay an egg. That egg will develop into a larva, which will then pupate and emerge as adults. Usually this entire process takes about a year, but we only see the adult usually for a short period, maybe a few weeks. These guys nest in all sorts of different ways. They can nest in cavities, like fissures in tree bark, or even houses that we might put out for them. They can nest in the soil, in wood, in pithy stems. as this is a cutaway showing a nest in wood and also in the soil. So how do these move around? How far will they go for food? Well, it varies. Some species of small bees move not very far away from a single yard. So what you individually might do could make it or break it for some species of bees, which is really amazing to think about. Others can travel miles. So large carpenter bees like this guy might be able to go more than a mile. Medium-sized bees, maybe 500 yards. Small bees, maybe 200 yards. And there's a big diversity in bee size. So here's a bee head of a large bee and then a tiny bee on its eyeball. So we're talking about a lot of variation here as well. So what are some common types? Well, one type that you might see in your yard are sweat bees. Sweat bees are soil nesting, and here is what their nest looks like in turf. They're called sweat bees because they are attracted to sweat, and many of them are metallic. They carry their pollen on their legs. Some of them are more rusty colored, but these are very common in gardens. Other common species are the leafcutter and mason bees. Mason bees make their nest in tunnels, and their nest cavities are separated by mud. And leafcutter bees use leaf material to make their nest. They have these large jaws. They're able to cut pieces of leaves, take it back to a cavity, and use that to construct individual nest cells. And carpenter bees. So the large carpenter bees, like this guy and this guy, they'll burrow right into wood. And they are large, but they are very gentle creatures. People are often afraid of them, but they are not at all aggressive. Sometimes they'll nest in the same area, and mothers and daughters tend to go back to the same sites as their mothers, as where they grew up. And so if you have them, you tend to have them year after year. There are also small carpenter bees that nest in pithy stems. So think about like raspberry stems or some mint species where the inside is sort of loose, almost like a styrofoam plant material. These can dig that material out. So things like blackberry, elderberry, box elder all have these pithy stems. These are often mistaken for wasps. They are really small and shiny. So what do we do to help all of these different creatures that are providing these important ecosystem functions in our landscape? We clearly design our landscape to be beautiful for us, which is great, but there are ways to do that that also help the environment. And I think that's what is really important to focus on. It's not in either here or there type of situation. We can do both with our landscape. So it can be beautiful and colorful, and functional, and also environmentally sound. And the ways to do that are, first and foremost, avoid applying pesticides. So whether you're thinking about helping the bees, or you want to encourage insects that will reduce pests in your garden, whatever types of insects you're looking to conserve, you don't want to apply pesticides. Pesticides are that you have access to at big box stores and hardware stores are mostly broad spectrum. Even if it has a picture of a spider on the label, it's probably going to kill a large number of different types of insects. And so this is really important to avoid. Beyond that, it's important to think about what sort of resources is my yard providing? Do I have season-long food for the different insects I want to support? Things like flowers, leaves, compost. Are there places for things to nest? Are there places that are protective, that things can survive the winter? And is there water? So insects have kind of the same basic needs as many types of animals. So how do we do this? Well, the first thing is to decide, well, what do I plant? The good news is there's a million different ways that you can provide resources that are going to support insects. So you can think aesthetically about what types of plants you might like and choose within that some plants that insects will also like. The most important things are to provide food and shelter across the season. So think especially about fall and spring blooming species. I know in my landscape, I always have containers of salvia because it blooms into October. and it will be absolutely covered with bees in October because there's barely anything blooming. And so I think that's a really important, easy annual that I can add in my landscape. Same thing with New England aster, which is a native plant that blooms late in the season. That's covered. So there's an example of a non-native container plant and a native plant. Both are important for different types of insects late in the season. So think about those endpoints. Garden for a diversity of colors and shapes of flowers. The more you do that, the more you're likely to provide habitat and resources for a large number of different insects with different types of mouth parts. Things with really long floral tubes, for instance, can't be accessed by predator insects that also feed on nectar that have really small mouth parts. Experiment with native plants. Denise has a great lineup of speakers that are going to tell you all about the benefits of native plants. That's an exciting option. Also, thinking about annuals and perennial combinations can be really beneficial because annuals are inexpensive and they have prolific nectar and pollen. But do note that some species are hybrids and do not produce resources. So for instance, in this lovely hanging basket, this sweet alyssum is a great plant because many predators and parasitoids will use it as a nectar resource when they can't find prey. But these petunias, while pretty, do not provide much of any resources. So it's good to have a combination of flowers like this because you're more likely to include some that are beneficial for insects. I think it's really important to explore the inclusion of native perennials, even if you have a very small landscape. In any size, you can include some type of pocket prairie or tiny planting of these plants. They are incredibly attractive to bees, predators, and parasitoid insects. They will be covered with beneficial insects. Also, many of these plants are rare and they provide food for birds and many other benefits that Doug will be talking about next time. They're host plants for butterflies and other insects. And as I said, they're food for wildlife. So within the native plant realm, man, you can find a lot of different plants depending on where you live. And the best thing to do is to go to a local garden center, see what they have, talk to some experts, think about height, shape, color, providing a lot of diversity and really experimenting. Go out into your garden, see what types of insects are using your plants as habitat, who's feeding where, and then go grow your garden from there. Well, last year, I had a lot of bees using this type of plant. I'm going to get a second one of those this year. I wanted to just show an example of how small this can be. So even in like a small patch, this is maybe 3 feet by 5 feet. I've got 6 or 7 types of native plants here. And this in the summer is absolutely covered with butterflies and bees and predatory insects. These in my area, our native plants are mostly prairie plants. So you do have to be aware that they can get very tall and bushy. But that's the aesthetic, it's a natural looking garden. And I personally think it's really beautiful. And just don't expect everything to be like very tight little bushes because that's not how it's going to look. But that's not how it should look, right? It's a prairie planting. You can also provide a lot of benefits by including ornamental non-native plants. So not everything has to be native to provide resources. You may already have some of these plants in your landscape, and certainly they can be very helpful for biodiversity. But there's a ton of variation. So for instance, in this picture, I have 2 types of, my gosh, I'm blanking on the name of these plants, not begonias. Anyway, it doesn't matter. Dahlias, good grief. Okay, so we have a single dahlia in the foreground, and you can see, if you look in this picture in the close-up, you can see the reproductive parts of the flower. And then I have a triple in the background. The single is a great plant for insects. They can access the resources, they can get the pollen and nectar. When plants are bred to be doubles and triples, the resources that they have diminish or are removed. And so those are not very valuable. Same thing with roses. Old varieties where you can see the reproductive parts, great plant for insects. Doubles and triples really are not going to be used. So look for those old varieties. Heirloom varieties is another word. Same thing with like hollyhocks. I have dahlias written on the slide. So any flower that comes in doubles and triples, look for that, singles. Another cool thing to look for are extra floral nectarines. So some of our insects like wasps and ladybugs and flies, they need nectar too. Nectar is energy, nectar is sugar, but they can't get down into deep flowers. They don't have a long tongue like a bee has. And extra floral nectaries are just areas of the plant where they produce nectar outside the flowers. And plants do this actually to attract these predators to their plant to protect them from pests. So you might find these nectaries on stems or at the bases of flowers or on leaves. And what's happening here is a little wasp has found this nectar at the base of this vetch flower. This is the back of a leaf, and this little dark indentation is an extra floral nectary. So there are many plant families that do this. If you Google extra floral nectaries, you can get lists of plants that do this, but these are just some common examples. There's many types of trees and shrubs you might include in your garden or landscape that provide these resources. Peonies are an example. When have you ever seen damage to a peony? Very rarely. It's because they produce extra floral nectaries and attract ants, and those ants protect the peony from any damage. Some plants even go so far as to make little drinking fountains for their nectaries. And so I just had to include this because it's so cute. Here are two insects feeding from extra floral nectary cups on plants. We can also incorporate, as I mentioned, annual plants into our landscapes. So you don't have to have a big space to provide resources. Here's an example of the salvia that I was talking about that blooms late into this season, incorporated with some other plants. Another great plant is this lantana, really easy to grow, provides resources all year long. Other ones I've had good success with are here in terms of easy to grow and also provide resources. When you're at the garden center, another good strategy is just to look for those bee and butterfly signs. If it helps bees and butterflies, probably a lot of other insects will visit it. We also really need to rethink lawns as a habitat. I know a lot of people will do all sorts of work to create these really nice wildlife garden beds, and then they use weed and feed on their grass. You are adding chemicals to your lawn, potentially harming insects that feed there or live in that soil, and also removing what could be a very easy resource. If you don't have a lot of funds to invest in a garden right away, don't discount your ability to support beneficial insects, because the clovers and other weedy plants that grow in grass are incredibly important resources for insects, especially in the early spring when there's not a lot out there. If you've heard of the No Mow May campaign, that's a program that suggests allowing dandelions and other resources to grow in the spring to support bees. Beyond flowers, we've got to think about where things are going to shelter and spend the winter. If you had to live outside as an insect, would this be an easy habitat to survive the winter? No, there's nowhere to go to escape the elements on a day like it is today in many parts of the US. So what do we want to do? Well, we want to incorporate shelters, nooks, crannies, cavities, places for things to burrow in and reproduce the next generation and spend the winter. This can be very ornate, or it can be as simple as a compost pile, incorporating some rocks and stones in your garden, and not removing all of the leaf material, all of the sticks, all of the habitat. Really thinking about how can I make my home more of a natural environment and still have the aesthetics that I want is, I think, a really fun goal to focus on in our landscaping. Also thinking about bee habitat specifically, people do often add these bee hotels, which can vary from tiny to very elaborate. These are used actually by bees. So these can be a fun way, especially if you have youth around the house, to observe bees in action. Leaving some cut pithy stems is another way to encourage some species. And if you do see bees nesting in the soil, sometimes people email me and say, what should I spray? I see something burrowing in the soil. No, if they found A lot of these bees have really specific soil that they like. If you happen to be lucky enough to have that soil, leave that space alone. They like it the way it is. More may come and nest in that area. Water. We also sometimes forget, insects need something to drink. If they get hot, just like we get hot. Incorporating some element of water into your landscape is really important. It could be a small pond, it could be a fountain, but it could also be really simple. Take a water trivet from under a pot, put stones inside, and add a tiny bit of water every morning when you go out to water. That'll provide a great insect bird bath for insects for them to forage for water. All right, well, somehow I did that in an hour. I covered a ton of information. I hope that it was informative for you guys. I want to thank Denise for putting together this series. I want to thank everybody. I'm amazed and so excited about the turnout that this many people wanted to learn about insect biodiversity. After a second here, I'll take questions from the chat. And also, this is my email address at Ohio State University if you want to get in touch with me to ask any further questions. So I'll give everybody a second to record that. Thank you very much.
Great, Mary, thank you so much. Always a wonderful session. I love the images and all the practical ideas too. Folks, we're right about at the top of the hour. So if you have to leave, a lot of you are doing what I was going to ask you. Please put a thank you into the chat box for Mary and all of her great information today. I know she'd appreciate that. We have a lot of questions. We won't get through all the questions, but I've kind of grouped some together. But Mary, the sentiment that really rose to the top is how much interest there is in your offer to do a workshop on presentation skills. So
that's good.
Yeah, so you and I will
have to incorporate that in the future.
Absolutely. You and I will put our schedules and our heads together and come up with something and open it to folks. So since you were registered for this program, we'll let everyone know when we'll pull something together. So lots and lots of thumbs up on that idea. So Mary, this is your fault. We've got lots of dung questions because you started with dung. And so,
which I know like the least about. So thanks, everyone.
Well, you can always pass, on questions from the mundane to the bizarre. So whose manure are these dung beetles eating? Do we know?
So there are dung beetles that eat all sorts of dung. There's an elephant. So everyone should Google elephant dung beetle. There's a large dung beetle that eats elephant dung. We do have dung beetles in the United States. They're much smaller, but most kinds of dung have some types of beetles that will feed either in it or they will ball it and carry away. Not all beetles are dung that feed on dung are dung beetles. They don't all make the little balls and bury it. Some of them actually feed within the manure pile and break it down that way. But yes, there are many types and they do have preferences. And they detect the odor and the odor attracts them to the dung pile. And this is important because we need, if you live on a cattle farm, you know how much dung can be produced and you would not want that to just sit in the field, right? We want it to be decomposed for the, nutrients in the dung. That's, manure that can be incorporated in the soil. So these are very important.
So I think a related question that does not, folks, get you off the hook of cleaning up your yard with dog doo-doo. Folks wanted to know which dung beetle will come and feed on the dog waste. And I'm not sure you can just leave it there and hope.
No, I don't. First of all, I don't think that there are many, if any, that specialize in dog dung. However, I could be wrong because I don't know that much about it. But it's not going to happen fast enough where people are going to be satisfied with that. I think you're still going to have to pick it up, unfortunately.
Okay, that's all the dung for now. So there were lots, I tried to group some themes together. So there were lots of questions about who eats fill in the blank. And so a lot of the questions were about some of our really difficult pest problems. Who eats stink bugs? Who eats cucumber beetles, viburnum leaf beetles, Japanese beetles? Are there any kind of overarching comments or themes you can offer to dealing with some of our big pest problems?
Well, so of those insects, there are not a ton of things that eat stink bug adults, but there are many things that eat stink bug eggs. So if you think about a stink bug adult, it's pretty big, it's very hard, and it smells bad. Like I wouldn't want to eat it, and a lot of other things don't want to eat it. But the eggs are consumed by a number of different predators, and also there are some parasitoids, including some that have been released to attack the stink bug, I believe. That's not an area that I focus on myself. Japanese beetles, I mentioned the flower wasp that attacks the larval stage. The Japanese beetle larvae are white grubs, those big grubs you might dig out of the garden. There are some things that attack those, but many things don't eat the adults. The adults are pretty large and they're pretty hard, so they're harder to eat, but birds will eat them. Some larger animals might eat them. So it really depends. And with some of these invasive insects like viburnum leaf beetle and Japanese beetle, it can be hard, because they can be so abundant that unfortunately that their presence is they're so abundant that you're not getting a total control by insect predators. So it's hard sometimes to note the value of the insect predators yourself when you're still seeing so many, but these are providing a lot of pest control nonetheless. And so sometimes we have to take other types of controls and add it on. For instance, with Japanese beetles, I tend to cut and collect as many, especially if my containers and things I want to look a certain way. I'll do a lot of collections of the beetles on a daily basis, which is very time consuming, but I just can't stand them. So I do that in addition to the predators being out there.
Okay. Several people commented about monarch butterflies and noticing some parasitoids on the larvae or eggs being eaten. I wonder if you can talk a little bit about monarchs.
Yeah, so a lot of us are getting into monarch conservation, which is so important. I know I have a lot of milkweed in my yard, and last year I was able to take a really cool video during flyover of like 40 monarchs feeding on my New England asters that I put in my yard to help with when they're going south. And so I'll tell a story about my husband because I think that this relates to why we all notice all these things. So he is not an entomologist, but he has gotten super into monitoring like each caterpillar. So he's out there looking at every egg, and if a caterpillar disappears, he gets super upset. If we put the same effort into watching every insect, we would notice that all insects have some level of parasitism, some level of predation of their larvae. And that is part of a healthy environment, right? That we have all of these different insects feeding on one another in a balanced way. So not every monarch caterpillar is going to be eaten, but some will be eaten. So you will notice some mortality. That is normal if you're watching them closely. If you're concerned about things eating the caterpillars, I have heard of people actually netting areas. I've never done this. I just kind of let them live in the milkweed. And I always have a lot of cocoons that, when I have colonization. But if you're having like extreme difficulty, there are people that specialize in monarch community science programs, I'm sure could provide, really good guidance on that. But I think a lot of it is that we're just paying a lot more attention. And then we're seeing, eggs disappearing and things that is a normal part of a food web in a backyard.
Those orange oleander aphids came up if we're talking about monarchs and milkweed. So this, colorful aphid that is often on our milkweed stems. Any comments on those, on who might be eating them or kind of aphids in general?
I don't think a lot of things eat those aphids because they sequester the milkweed secondary plant chemicals. But I get a ton of questions about if they harm the larvae of the monarch. And I actually looked into this because I got a question about it in a previous webinar. And there was a paper that actually found they do not reduce the nutritional quality of the plant for the larvae. So I don't think they're a problem. What I tend to do, I like my milkweed to resprout a few times during the season because the younger leaves are better for caterpillars. consumption and tend to attract the adults to lay eggs. They like to lay eggs on the newer foliage. So I'll cut back, especially if I get a large infestation of the aphids. I'll chop my milkweed and it will resprout, mid-season with a lot of new foliage. And I found that that's a good way to control the aphids so they don't get totally out of control and also provide that new foliage.
And when you were in Michigan, you were in Doug Landis's lab, is that right? Or you worked with him?
Yes.
Because he has some great research about the egg predation on milkweed and just what you said, kind of cutting back and allowing it to reflush to avoid some of that ant predation on eggs.
And that's actually where who I learned to cut back the milkweed from. So he has a lot of good extension materials about how you should manage your milkweed if people are interested.
Great. There were questions about ladybird beetles and how some are good, some are bad, some are native, some are not. How can we foster them? Any special plants that we can grow?
So that could be a whole webinar. So a lot of my research actually focuses on that. So if you're interested in that, feel free to contact me and we can talk ladybugs in more detail. But just really briefly, native and exotic lady beetles have extreme niche overlap, which means that they feed on the same stuff, they live in the same places, and so they're competing with one another. And unfortunately, because of that, because we have exotic species, there are less resources for native species who now have to compete with those exotic species. And as a result, many of our native species have become rare. And there's a lot of interest in conserving them. Some of the best ways that you can conserve them are some of the things I talked about. Increasing the amount of habitat is going to provide habitat for both native and non-native ladybugs. Reducing pesticide use is going to provide more food for them and more habitat for them. Another thing that native ladybugs need are patches of forest habitat to overwinter. So conserving forest habitat in our landscape is critical for many of those species.
Okay, folks, my chat ability has been taken away from me. So if someone can just type in Doug Landis into the chat box, someone had a question about who was doing that work in Michigan, and I just couldn't type in an answer.
Doug Landis. Somebody did. Cool.
Good. Mary, there were questions about, this could almost be a thumbs up, thumbs down. So this thing and beneficials. So the first one is mulch.
Good for some, bad for others. Good for spiders, ground dwelling beetles, and things. Some bees do not like mulch, so put it in some places, put it in vegetable gardens, leave some spaces open, especially if you see ground nesting bees using the site.
Okay, there were a couple questions about BT, and maybe you could just kind of briefly talk about what that is, but then is that good or bad for these beneficials?
BT is a bacterial pesticide. It's a specialist bacterium that is used to control some insects. So the only BT that I use in my own landscape, I use mosquito dunks in my water sources. So mosquitoes harbor West Nile virus in my area. They're a nuisance pest, right? And so I don't want to, by adding water sources for beneficial insects, I want to control mosquitoes. And so I add BT mosquito dunks to my water sources. Those are only going to kill fly larvae within my water source. They're special, the bacteria only attack those. Now, some other types of BT might have broader spectrum. For instance, there are BTs that attack lepidopteran caterpillars. So if you apply that BT, it would kill, some number of different caterpillar insects. Some of those caterpillars might be caterpillars that you want to have. And so that BT could potentially be harmful. So it's very important, just like any pesticide, even though this is a natural product or a organic insecticide or something in that category, you still need to understand the target, and it should say that on the label.
Okay. You did talk about buying plants in the nursery and how sometimes they're labeled with what they're beneficial to. And I'm sorry if I missed, did you talk about neonics? Because there were questions about neonicotinoids and whether that's a concern.
Good question. Many garden centers have stopped using neonics, and usually they will promote this on their website, or you can ask. You definitely do not want a seed treated plant material to start from. Especially an annual, because it's only going to be there for that season. And depending on when it was treated, it may have that pesticide in its pollen and nectar, the beginning of its flowering, or for some portion of its bloom period, depending on when it was treated. So, I would definitely avoid that and make sure that the source that you're getting your plants from does not use that in their production.
Great. And then how about herbicides in general? You talked about herbicides if they're taking out dandelions or clover in the lawn, but in general, are herbicides dangerous to insects and specifically beneficials?
So for sure, any pesticide that is an insecticide is going to be have a negative impact on beneficials, right? But we don't really think about herbicides and fungicides having impacts, but some of them have been shown to negatively impact beneficial insects directly, having negative impacts on them directly. And they also can have negative impacts in that they're taking away resources. So they can have indirect negative impacts and direct negative.
Okay, great. And let's wrap up with where folks can go to get more information. I mentioned your book already. I put a link, folks, into the chat box. It was a long time ago, but readily available at your favorite bookstore, at Amazon, The Good Garden Bugs. But do you have other book suggestions, resource suggestions for people who are maybe just getting interested in insects and want to learn more?
One of my next stops, if you're really excited after hearing the webinar and want to learn more, I would go to the Xerces Society website. Can I put stuff in the chat?
You should be able to.
Okay, maybe I can just quickly link that in the chat.
And I think folks on the reading tab, I'm not sure why some folks couldn't connect, but on our Tending Nature website, the Learn With Us tab, I do have Xerces linked there as a resource.
Okay, I'm going to put this in the chat. The Xerces Society is an amazing source of information, plant lists, guides that you can use on how to manage your landscape, information about rare insects, all sorts of different great information. And a lot of it's regional, so you can put in your zip code and find out, what's good for my area. So that would be my next stop. And it's all, freely available information.
Great, thanks, Mary. And a couple of folks had questions about honeybees and whether there are some issues between wild bees and honeybees. And Xerces has a really nice publication on their website that looks at a lot of the research literature on competition. And so that's a good place to start as well.
Great.
Yeah. So Mary, thanks again. Always love to have you on these webinars. I learned so much from you. And folks, thanks for all the nice comments in the chat box. Thanks for coming this morning. And we'll see you next Friday, 10 a.m. Eastern.
Thanks, Denise. Thanks, you guys, for all the comments are making my day. I really appreciate it. So thanks, everybody. I hope you enjoy the rest of the series. It's going to be a great one. Thanks.